I can sew that shut. The man under the oak tree looked up. A young woman stood on the sidewalk, a brown paper bag tucked against her side. I can stitch that up, she said again. That tear right there. If you keep moving your arm too much, the sleeve is going to rip wide open. The man glanced down at his torn shirt, then looked back at her. No need, he said. Just leave it alone. It'll only take a minute. I said no. She shifted the bag to her other hand and studied the seam with the seriousness of a seamstress inspecting damage. Then she sat down on the bench built around the old oak tree, making a small creaking sound. She did not sit too close, but close enough to show that she had no intention of leaving. He frowned. What are you doing? Looking at the tear. I can fix it. I didn't ask you to fix it. No, sir, but it's right there. Richard Whitmore stared at her. She opened the paper bag and took out a small sewing kit. Richard's patience finally ran out. What is wrong with you? He said, his voice sharper than he had intended. Why do you keep insisting on sewing my shirt? I told you no. No means no. The young woman froze, the sewing kit still in her hand. Across the street, a married couple in matching sneakers slowed near the diner. They were the kind of people who walked 2 laps around Main Street every morning, swinging their arms and commenting on everyone else's business as though exercise gave them permission to do so. The wife noticed Richard's torn shirt first, then the young woman holding the needle and thread. Her eyes lit up, not with concern, but with the small, petty pleasure some people found in turning someone else's awkward moment into a joke. Oh, Harold, she said, nudging her husband. Look at that. She's trying to get that poor old man to take his shirt off right here on Main Street. Harold leaned forward, looking amused. Well, I suppose that's one way to get a fitting. The wife covered her mouth, but she could not hide her smile. At his age, he ought to be grateful someone is still asking. Harold laughed louder than the joke deserved. Richard's face flushed red. The young woman looked down at the sewing kit, embarrassed but not ashamed. She had not thought of it that way. She had only seen a torn seam and thought of thread. The couple noticed Richard's anger, and that seemed to please them even more. The wife raised her eyebrows as if daring him to react. Harold smirked into his coffee cup, satisfied with his own little joke. Richard shot to his feet so suddenly that the bench creaked beneath him. That's enough, he snapped. The wife blinked, but the faint smile remained on her lips. Don't be so upset. We were only joking. Richard turned fully toward them. Joking? Harold gave a dry laugh. Come on, friend. If you sit under a tree with your shirt torn open and a young lady fussing over you, people are going to notice. The wife laughed again. That thin, sharp sound made something inside Richard snap. He had endured Hank Doyle shoving him. He had endured having his shirt torn. He had endured the way people looked away when a man was bullied in the middle of the street. But the couple's enjoyment, their open delight in turning a young woman's kindness into something dirty, hurt more than being slammed against the oak tree. His voice rang out across the street. Get out of here. The couple stared at him. Richard stepped toward the curb, his shirt ripped open at the shoulder, his face burning with anger. I said, get out of here, he roared. You see a young woman trying to help someone, and the first thing you do is make it filthy. What kind of people are you? The wife's smile vanished. There's no need to yell like that. There was no need for either of you to open your mouths in the first place. Richard shot back. Move along. Harold's face hardened. You don't get to tell my wife where to go. Richard pointed down the sidewalk. I just did. Harold looked as if he wanted to argue, but Richard's anger had changed the air around them. The wife tugged at Harold's sleeve. Come on, he isn't worth it. They walked away stiffly, but not silently. The wife muttered something about crazy people on the street. Harold glanced back once, but he did not stop. Richard remained standing until they had passed the diner. Then another voice called from behind him. Well, well, Hank Doyle shouted from the doorway of Riley's bar. Look who finally found his temper. Richard turned. Hank stood with one hand against the bar door, grinning as though he had returned for the second act of a play. His hair was damp with sweat, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked at the torn shirt, then at the young woman, then back at Richard. That shirt still holding together? Hank said. I thought I tore it better than that. The young woman lifted her head. Now she understood. Her eyes moved from Hank to the tear in Richard's shirt. You did that? She asked. Hank gave her an exaggerated bow. Guilty. That's a shameful thing to brag about. Hank's grin widened. Listen to her. This little seamstress has a mouth on her. Richard stepped between them before he had time to think. Leave, he said. Hank laughed. Or what? You going to yell at me too? Richard did not answer. Hank moved closer, slow and relaxed, enjoying the attention from the street. Funny thing, he said. 10 minutes ago, you didn't say a word when I shoved you into that tree. Now you're shouting like a preacher because a couple of old folks hurt your feelings. The young woman still stood there with the sewing kit in her hand. Sir, you should leave him alone. Hank looked at her with contempt. And you should mind your own business. She is minding her business, Richard said. Hank tilted his head. What's that supposed to mean? It means she is doing what decent people do when they see something wrong. The words landed harder than Richard expected. Hank's expression changed. Not much, but enough to notice. Men like Hank did not like being measured against standards they could never meet. Are you calling me indecent? Richard looked him straight in the eye. I'm saying you're drunk, loud, and standing too close. For one tense moment, Hank looked ready to lunge again. Then the young woman spoke, her voice calm and firm. If you tear that shirt anymore, I'm going to charge you for it. The unexpectedness of the remark broke some of the tension. One of the old men standing outside the barber shop coughed into his cup to hide a laugh. Even Richard turned slightly. Surprised. Hank scowled. You think you're funny? No, she said. I think you're in my way. Hank stared at her, then at Richard, as if wondering whether the morning still belonged to him. He spat near the curb. This town's gone soft, he muttered. Can't joke with anybody anymore. That wasn't a joke, the young woman said. Hank pointed at Richard. You and that ragged shirt better stay out of my way. Richard's voice dropped. Next time you choose a path, try doing it sober. Hank's jaw twitched, but he did not step closer. Finally, he turned and staggered back toward Riley's bar, throwing one last curse over his shoulder before disappearing inside. The street slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The young woman sat back down on the bench as if the entire interruption had only delayed one simple task. She opened the sewing kit again. Let me stitch the tear, she said. Just enough so it doesn't rip any farther. Richard turned to look at her, the heat of his anger still burning in his chest. His pride had just been dragged across the street in front of the whole town. Do you not understand what just happened? He snapped. You kept insisting on fixing this shirt, and now everyone here thinks I'm some foolish old man making a spectacle of himself. I told you to leave it alone. You wouldn't let it go. Those two heard you talking about taking my shirt off, and you saw what happened. The young woman lowered the needle, but she did not look away. I didn't make them cruel, she said. No, but you gave them something to laugh at. They were already looking for something to laugh at. Richard opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He glanced down at the tear on his shoulder. It had widened when he shouted at Hank. One more wrong movement, and the seam might split all the way down the sleeve. He hated the feeling of knowing she was right. The girl noticed where his eyes had fallen. Let me stitch it up, she said. Just enough to keep it from getting worse. Richard let out a short breath. You really don't ever give up, do you? Not when I have a needle and thread in my hand, and a tear right in front of me. It's just a shirt. Then fixing it won't hurt anything. He looked across the street. The men outside Cooper's barber shop had gone back to their coffee, but one of them still glanced over every few seconds. Richard pressed his lips together. I'm not in much of a hurry, he said, more to himself than to her. Then let me do it. He looked at her face, open, calm, and patient. Then he looked back down at the torn shoulder. What if someone decides to make fun of this again? They might. That doesn't bother you? It does. But not enough to leave something unfixed just because some people don't know how to keep their mouths shut. Richard watched her for a moment. There was nothing dramatic in her voice, no grand speech meant to force him into agreeing. She was simply being practical. The shirt was torn. She had a needle. He was standing there with nowhere urgent to be, and whether he wanted to admit it or not, he did not want to walk around his hometown with a tear gaping open on his shoulder. Finally, he said, All right. She looked slightly surprised. All right? You can stitch it up. Good. She held out her hand. Give me the shirt. Richard raised an eyebrow. That's it? I can't sew it properly while you're wearing it, unless you want me to stick the needle into your shoulder. He glanced toward the diner window again. You understand why that might draw attention, don't you? It already has. Now we might as well make it useful. That answer caught him off guard. He almost smiled, but only almost. You still have an undershirt on, she added, turning her face away before he moved. I'm not trying to embarrass you. I know. His tone had changed. She heard it, but said nothing. Richard slowly unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it off carefully, making sure not to tear the shoulder any further. Underneath, he wore a plain white undershirt. When he handed her the shirt, she took it with both hands. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories about kindness, dignity, and hope. Not like a rag, not like a stranger's problem, but like something that was still worth taking care of. She turned the shirt inside out and laid it across her lap. He pulled hard. Richard sat beside her, leaving some space between them. You know who did it then? I know who bragged about it, she said, but the one who brags isn't always the one who did it. In his case, he was. She made a small sound, not quite agreement and not quite judgment. Then she threaded the needle and bent over the tear at the shoulder. Richard watched the first stitch disappear into the fabric. A small stitch, a pull of thread, a fold of cloth, another small stitch, another pull. She sewed quickly, but not carelessly. Each stitch lined up with the next, as if her fingers already knew the path before her eyes had to check it. The white thread was not a perfect match, but it was close enough. More importantly, it was strong. Without his shirt, Richard felt exposed in a way that had little to do with cotton. The oak tree cast broken patches of shade across the bench. Above them, the leaves stirred in the soft Georgia sunlight. The street looked ordinary, like any other small-town street. But the memories were beginning to press heavily against his chest. Where did you learn to do that, he asked. My grandmother. Does she still work? When her hands let her, the girl pulled the thread tight and checked the strength of the seam. Some mornings, her hands hurt badly. She doesn't say it, but I can tell by how long she holds her coffee cup. Richard heard no complaint in her voice. Only quiet observation, and a kind of love kept carefully hidden. He had known people who turned every hardship into a performance. This girl did not. She spoke as if life was something to face, not something to display for sympathy. What kind of shop does she run? Mostly alterations and repairs. Church suits, work pants, evening dresses when people can still afford them, curtains, uniforms. She used to alter wedding gowns too. People came from Macon, maybe even Savannah. She still has pictures on the wall from when business was good. When was that? The girl gave a small shrug. Before things changed. Now people buy cheap clothes, wear them twice, and throw them away. Main Street isn't what it used to be, either. Half the stores are gone. The other half look like they're waiting their turn. Richard looked toward the empty train depot at the end of the block. I noticed. Are you from here? He paused. A long time ago. How long? Long enough that I still expect Miller's Bakery to be on the corner. She looked up at him. That place closed before I was born. I figured. My grandmother still talks about their peach cobbler like it was something holy. Richard's chest tightened. It was very close. The girl smiled down at the seam. So you really are from here. He had not expected that to hurt. He had spent decades being introduced as founder, chairman, investor, donor. Nobody in those rooms cared where he had bought candy as a boy, or which corner flooded in summer rain. To be from somewhere was different from owning things in many places. He had almost forgotten that. Annie turned the shirt right side out and examined her work. It'll show some, but not bad. Showing doesn't bother me. It did a few minutes ago. He looked at her sharply, then saw the faint curve at the corner of her mouth. You enjoy making a point? Only when the point is already sitting there. Richard shook his head. Your grandmother raised you brave. She raised me to keep my eyes open. Brave is something you find out later. He took that in quietly. The girl spoke the way older people did in small southern towns, plain words, little waste. Truth tucked into ordinary conversation. What's your name? He asked. Annie. That all? That's enough for folks around here. He nodded once. I'm Richard. Nice to meet you, Mr. Richard. Just Richard. My grandmother says people over 40 who ask to be called by their first name are usually hiding either money or bad behavior. Richard let out a surprised laugh before he could stop it. And which one do you think I'm hiding? Annie pretended to study him. You seem too tense to be poor. That obvious? A little. She handed the shirt back to him. Richard slipped it on carefully and buttoned the front while Annie packed away the thread. The repaired shoulder sat straighter now. The stitches were visible if someone looked close enough, but the tear no longer pulled open. "Feels better," he admitted. "Told you. You usually this stubborn with strangers? Only the ones acting difficult before lunchtime." Richard glanced toward Riley's bar again. Then today must feel productive. Annie followed his gaze. Hank Doyle wasn't always like that. No? He used to work at the lumber yard before it shut down, then drinking became his full-time profession. Richard looked down the street lined with fading storefronts. Seems this town lost more than one thing. Annie gave a small shrug. That's what happens when factories close and young people leave. And the people who stay? They learn how to repair things. The answer settled between them. As they walked farther down Main Street, Richard noticed details he had missed earlier. The old movie theater marquee still hung above the sidewalk, though half the letters were missing. A church bulletin board announced a fish fry fundraiser beside a notice for unpaid water bills. Two boys rode bicycles through the parking lot behind the hardware store, their laughter bouncing off brick walls baked by the Georgia sun. It was strange what survived. Annie adjusted the paper bag against her hip. "You really came back looking for my grandma?" "Yes." 32 years later? "Yes. You must have owed her a lot." Richard thought about that before answering. When somebody helps you at the exact moment your life could have gone another direction, you remember it. Annie looked ahead as they crossed in front of the old post office. "My grandma says people remember pain fast and kindness slow. She sounds wiser than most politicians I know." That made Annie glance sideways at him. "You know politicians?" "A few. Good ones?" Richard considered lying, then decided against it. "Not enough." Annie snorted softly. They reached the far end of Main Street where the buildings became older and narrower. Carter Stitch and Alterations sat between a vacant insurance office and a barber supply store with dusty windows. The shop looked smaller than Richard remembered, though memory had a habit of enlarging things attached to survival. The faded wooden sign still hung above the door. Carter Stitch and Alterations. One corner sagged lower than the other. Richard stopped walking. Annie noticed. "You okay?" He stared at the sign for several seconds before speaking. "When I left this town, I told myself if I ever became successful, I'd come back here first. But you didn't." "No." "Why?" Richard smiled without humor. "At first I was too broke. Then too busy. Then too proud to admit how long I'd waited." Annie nodded slowly as if she understood more than someone her age should. "People do that around here too," she said. "Wait too long." The front window displayed two dress forms wearing half-finished church outfits. Beside them sat a small hand-painted sign, "We fix what others throw away." Richard stared at the words. Annie pushed open the screen door. A bell rattled overhead, followed by the familiar scent of fabric, steam, old wood, and starch. The smell hit Richard harder than he expected. Memory rose instantly. Rain against windows, soup simmering, a yellow lamp glowing over careful hands. Inside the shop, sunlight fell across rows of hanging garments protected by clear plastic covers. Spools of thread-filled wooden shelves behind the counter in every shade imaginable. An old Singer sewing machine sat near the front window beside a pair of thick reading glasses. The machine was running, steady, rhythmic, click, click, click. An elderly black woman sat behind it with silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She wore a pale blue cardigan despite the heat and leaned slightly forward while guiding dark fabric beneath the needle. She did not look up immediately. "Annie," she said, still sewing, "did you remember the navy thread this time, or are we improvising another funeral suit?" "I got both spools." "Good. Last thing grieving people need is crooked hems." Only then did she lift her eyes. Richard felt the air leave his lungs. Time had bent her shoulders and silvered her hair. But the eyes were the same. Calm. Sharp. Tired in a patient kind of way. Evelyn Carter looked first at Annie, then at Richard standing silently behind her. Her gaze moved to the repaired shoulder seam. "Well," she said slowly, "either Annie's been practicing her stitches or somebody had a rough morning." Annie set the bag on the counter. "Bit of both." Evelyn removed her glasses. "And who might this be?" Richard opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For 32 years he had rehearsed this moment in airports, hotels, black cars, offices overlooking skylines. In every version, He sounded prepared. Now he stood in front of her, unable to form a sentence. Evelyn watched him carefully. Then her expression changed just slightly. Not recognition. Not yet. But something close to it. "You look familiar," she said quietly. Richard swallowed hard. "I should," he replied. "You saved my life once." Evelyn Carter held Richard's gaze for several quiet seconds. The sewing machine had stopped, but the wheel still ticked softly as it slowed. Annie looked between them, sensing something shift inside the small shop. "You saved my life once," Richard repeated. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. "That's a mighty large statement for a Monday morning." "It's true." She studied his face carefully now. Age had changed him. Wealth had polished him. But underneath both, something familiar remained around the eyes. Something tired and stubborn at the same time. "You said 32 years?" she asked. Richard nodded. Evelyn's fingers rested lightly on the sewing table. "Rainstorm?" His throat tightened. "Yes. You came in after closing, carrying a cardboard suitcase held together with rope." Richard let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. "You remember?" "I remember hungry people." Evelyn glanced at Annie. "Sit down before one of you falls over." Annie pulled out 2 mismatched wooden chairs near the counter. Richard sat carefully, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. The confidence that filled boardrooms deserted him completely inside this little sewing shop. Evelyn pointed at his shoulder. "Let me see what happened there." Annie immediately defended herself. "I stitched it enough to hold." "I can tell." Evelyn stood slowly from the sewing machine, one hand briefly pressing against her knee before she crossed the room. "Your stitches are straighter than last month." "That's almost a compliment." "Don't get excited." Richard watched them with something close to wonder. The conversation moved with old familiarity, the kind built from years of shared kitchens, bills, disappointments, and small victories. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and examined the seam Annie had repaired. "Not bad," she admitted. "Though your tension's a little tight here. I was working outside." "You're always working outside something." Annie smiled faintly. Evelyn looked up at Richard. "Take the shirt off again." Richard laughed quietly. "You sound exactly like her." "Like who?" "The woman I remembered." Evelyn gave him a look. "Flattery doesn't lower alteration prices." Annie covered a grin while Richard unbuttoned the shirt again. This time he noticed something different. He no longer felt embarrassed sitting there in an undershirt while a seamstress inspected damaged fabric. The shame from Main Street had loosened somewhere between the oak tree and this shop. Evelyn turned the shoulder inside out. "Lord, Annie, what happened to this thing? Somebody try to wrestle a bear?" "Hank Doyle," Annie said. Evelyn stopped moving. "That man still breathing whiskey instead of oxygen?" "Apparently." Evelyn clicked her tongue. "Town would improve 10% if somebody locked Riley's bar for a month." Richard smiled. "You still speak your mind. At my age, wasting time becomes offensive." She threaded a darker spool through another needle, with practiced ease. Her hands trembled slightly, before steadying themselves against the cloth. Richard noticed it immediately. "You should sit," he said. Evelyn looked up over her glasses. "And you should stop telling old women what to do in their own shops." Annie muttered. "Told you." Richard raised both hands in surrender. "Fair enough." The sewing machine started again. Click, click, click. Richard closed his eyes for half a second as the sound carried him backward through time. He remembered sitting in this same room soaked from rain, pretending not to shiver because pride mattered more when a man owned nothing else. Evelyn had heated soup on a hot plate in the corner while mending his shirt under the yellow lamp. Back then the shop had seemed larger, safer too. "You disappeared fast after that interview," Evelyn said while sewing. "I figured you found work." "I did." "You could have written." "I know." "You didn't." "No." Evelyn nodded once as if placing another piece into an old puzzle. "Usually means either prison or success." Annie nearly choked, trying not to laugh. Richard smiled into his hands. "Thankfully the second one." "What kind of work?" "Shipping first, then warehouses, manufacturing after that." Evelyn's machine slowed. "You own Whitmore Industries." It was not a question. Richard looked up. Annie's eyes widened for the first time since meeting him. "You know the company?" he asked. Evelyn snorted softly. "Child, I may be old, but I'm not buried. Your face was in the paper last year next to some hospital donation." Richard glanced at Annie. "And you didn't recognize me?" Annie shrugged. Most billionaires don't sit under trees yelling at strangers with ripped shirts. That's comforting. It's honest. Evelyn gave Annie a side look. You gave this man trouble already, didn't you? He gave me trouble first. Richard pointed lightly toward Annie. That part is true. Evelyn shook her head while guiding the fabric beneath the needle. Both of you sound exhausting. The room settled into an easy rhythm after that. Outside, Main Street traffic drifted past in waves. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang noon. Annie unpacked groceries onto a small side table while Evelyn worked. You still make red bean soup? Richard asked suddenly. Evelyn looked at him without lifting her head fully. Every Thursday. Richard smiled to himself. I used to think it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. That's because you were starving. Probably. No, probably about it. You ate 3 bowls and nearly cried into the 4th. Annie laughed openly now. You cried over soup? Richard rubbed the back of his neck. I was 18. And dramatic, Evelyn added. Hungry men are dramatic. That's true. Evelyn finished reinforcing the shoulder seam and clipped the thread clean. She held the shirt up between both hands and inspected it the way a doctor might examine healing skin. There, she said. Now it'll survive another bad decision. Richard stood to take it. Thank you. Evelyn handed it over but kept hold of one sleeve a second longer. You came all the way back here just to thank me? Richard hesitated. The truth sounded strange even in his own head. He had spent decades building a company large enough to employ thousands. Yet one unfinished kindness had remained heavier than entire contracts. I kept thinking about that night, he admitted. More than I should have. Evelyn released the sleeve slowly. Kindness sticks harder when somebody receives it at the bottom. Annie grew quieter hearing that. Richard buttoned the shirt carefully over the repaired seam. You gave me food, fixed my clothes, and refused to let me sleep outside in the rain. Most people wouldn't have opened the door. Evelyn returned to her chair with a faint groan in her knees. Most people are too busy deciding who deserves help first. The word sat heavily in the little shop. Richard looked around at the faded photographs on the wall. Wedding dresses, graduation suits, church choirs lined shoulder to shoulder. Decades of people stitched into the history of one room. You kept this place alive a long time, he said. Evelyn smiled faintly. Alive and profitable are two different things. Annie glanced down at the grocery bag. Richard noticed. The medicine bottle inside had been the cheap store brand. The loaf of bread was discounted. The hem of Annie's cardigan sleeve had been repaired twice by hand. Wealth taught men how to spot hidden numbers. Richard suddenly saw them everywhere in this room. Late bills, slow months, repairs postponed. Evelyn followed his eyes and understood immediately. Don't, she said calmly. Richard looked back at her. Don't what? Don't sit there feeling sorry for us. I've buried enough pride already. I won't bury dignity with it. The room fell silent. Then Annie spoke gently without looking up from unpacking groceries. She says that every time somebody offers help, Evelyn pointed a finger at her granddaughter. And one day you'll learn I'm right. Richard sat back down slowly. For the first time since entering the shop, he understood this reunion was not going to be simple gratitude and warm memories. Whatever debt he carried from 32 years ago still mattered deeply to him. But to Evelyn Carter, accepting anything in return might feel like losing something far more important. Richard stayed seated after Evelyn's words settled across the room. Outside, a truck rumbled past the shop windows, rattling the loose corner of the faded sign above the door. Annie finished putting away the groceries and quietly carried the medicine bottle toward a shelf near the sink. Evelyn noticed immediately. Did they raise the price again? $3. Evelyn muttered under her breath. These pharmacies think old age comes with a gold mine. Richard pretended not to hear, though he did. Annie unscrewed the bottle cap and checked the pills. You've got enough for another week. That depends on whether my knees cooperate with rationing. You can't ration arthritis medicine. Watch me. Richard leaned back in the wooden chair, studying the two women without making it obvious. He had spent most of his life around polished people. Executives with rehearsed smiles, investors who measured compassion like a tax deduction, politicians who remembered names only when cameras were present. Nothing inside this little shop felt rehearsed. That unsettled him more than Main Street had. Evelyn returned to the sewing machine and adjusted a stack of folded trousers waiting for repair. So, she said casually, How rich are you exactly? Annie nearly dropped a spoon into the sink. Grandma, what? If the man owns half the warehouses in Georgia, I'm curious. Richard laughed softly. Not half. Quarter? Closer than I'm comfortable admitting. Evelyn nodded as if confirming something practical. Then you can probably afford lunch. I can manage lunch. Good. Annie burns grilled cheese when she's distracted. I burned it once. You burned soup too. That pot was crooked. Richard smiled before catching himself doing it. Annie noticed. There it is. What? The face you make when you forget to act important. Richard shook his head. You enjoy bothering people, only the ones wearing expensive watches and pretending they don't. His hand instinctively covered the watch at his wrist. Annie pointed immediately. See? Evelyn chuckled quietly while sorting thread. Annie notices everything. Used to drive her teachers crazy. That's because teachers don't like being corrected by teenagers. Richard looked around the shop again. How long have you been here? 41 years in this building, Evelyn said. Before that, I rented a corner beside the laundromat. She paused, back when Main Street still had enough people walking through it to keep dust from settling. Richard glanced toward the front window. It used to feel bigger. That's because you were young. No, he said quietly. It used to feel alive. Evelyn looked at him carefully after that. You carry guilt around like luggage, she said. Richard let out a breath through his nose. That obvious? To old women? Usually. Annie leaned against the counter. What exactly are you guilty about? Richard took a moment before answering. Leaving. People leave all the time. I left knowing folks like your grandmother stayed behind helping people while I spent 30 years making money. Evelyn waved a dismissive hand. Money's useful. Don't insult it. Hard enough surviving without pretending otherwise. But you struggled. So did you. Richard looked up. Evelyn threaded another needle. You think I didn't recognize that look when you walked in here years ago? Thin boy trying hard to stand tall because pride was the only thing not soaked through. The memory hit him harder hearing her say it aloud. I slept behind a gas station the night before, he admitted quietly. Annie stopped moving around the counter. Richard stared at the floorboards as he spoke. I hadn't eaten since the previous morning. My father had already drunk away most of what we owned. My mother was gone. I kept telling myself I was headed somewhere better, but truth was, I had nowhere. Evelyn listened without interruption. I saw your light through the rain, he continued. That's why I knocked. You looked like a stray dog somebody had kicked too many times. Annie glanced between them. Grandma. Well, he did. Richard laughed softly despite himself. You gave me soup before asking my name. Hungry people deserve food before conversation. The sewing machine hummed again for a few seconds. Richard rubbed his hands together slowly. I never forgot that. You weren't supposed to, Evelyn said. I kept meaning to come back sooner. But you didn't. No. Evelyn nodded as if she already understood every reason without needing to hear them. Success makes people postpone the human parts of life. The room quieted again. Then Annie asked carefully, do people know you're here? A few. You got family? Asson. Just one? Yes. Annie studied him. You don't sound happy when you say that. Richard smiled faintly. My son and I understand business better than each other. That sounds lonely. It is. The honesty surprised even him. Evelyn pointed her needle toward him. There it is. What? The truth. Wealthy people usually drag it out like bad furniture. Richard shook his head again. You haven't changed. Course I have. My knees predict weather now. Annie laughed while opening a small refrigerator near the back wall. You want tea, Mr. Richard? Yes, please. Sweet or unsweet? Sweet. I'm only 2 planks, southern enough for that. Good answer. She poured tea into thick glasses cloudy from years of use. Richard stared at the glass she handed him, a chipped corner near the rim. His eyes narrowed. This can't be the same glass. Annie frowned. What? Richard turned it slowly in his hand. 32 years ago, she gave me sweet tea in a glass with this exact chip. Evelyn barely glanced over. Probably is. You kept it? Didn't see a reason to throw it away. Richard stared at the old glass longer than he should have. Back in New York, people drank from crystal worth hundreds of dollars. Entire meetings happened around polished tables discussing market shares and acquisitions, while assistants replaced untouched drinks every hour. Yet somehow this worn kitchen glass carried more memory than any of it. Annie watched him quietly. You really remember all this? I remember every detail. That's unusual. No, Evelyn said softly while adjusting fabric beneath the needle. That's what happens when somebody helps you before the world teaches you not to expect kindness. The sewing machine started again. Click, click, click. Richard closed his fingers around the glass. For the first time in years, he felt something he had almost forgotten during decades of hotels, boardrooms, and private flights. He felt still. Then the bell above the front door rattled sharply. All three turned. Hank Doyle staggered into the shop smelling of whiskey and afternoon heat. His eyes landed first on Richard, then on the repaired shirt. Well now, Hank said with a crooked grin. Looks like the rich old man found himself some sewing help after all. The bell above the front door rattled sharply. All three turned. Hank Doyle staggered into the shop smelling of whiskey and afternoon heat. His eyes landed first on Richard, then on the repaired shoulder seam. Well now, Hank said with a crooked grin. Looks like the rich old man found himself some sewing help after all. Annie's face tightened immediately. You need to leave. Hank ignored her and wandered farther inside, boots dragging against the worn wooden floor. He looked around the shop with the casual disrespect of a man who had spent years entering places without being told no often enough. Been a while since I came in here, he said. Smells exactly the same. Dust and old people. Evelyn did not even look up from the sewing machine. And yet somehow you still wandered in, she replied. That made Annie hide a smile. Hank pointed at Richard's shoulder. I got to admit though, Miss Evelyn, your granddaughter does decent work. I nearly tore that thing clean open. Richard stood slowly. The movement changed the room. Hank noticed it too, though the grin stayed on his face. Oh, relax, Hank said. Ain't like I stabbed you. No, Richard answered calmly. You just acted like a coward in public. Hank laughed once. There he is. Big city backbone finally showed up. Annie stepped between them before the distance could shrink further. Mr. Doyle, seriously, go home. Hank squinted at her. You always this protective over strangers? She's protective over decent behavior, Evelyn said. That's why you look unfamiliar in here. Hank's grin faded slightly. He wandered toward the counter and picked up a measuring tape before Annie snatched it from his hand. Don't touch things, she said. What, you charging museum prices now? No, I just know where your hands have been. Richard almost laughed despite himself. Hank noticed. Look at that. Rich boy's getting comfortable. Richard's patience thinned. You done? Not yet. Hank rocked slightly on his heels. Funny thing is, I knew you looked familiar after a while. Richard's eyes narrowed. Hank pointed lazily toward him. Saw your face somewhere. Newspaper maybe. TV. Annie glanced quickly at Richard. Hank snapped his fingers. That's it. Whitmore. Warehouse King. The room went quiet. Richard said nothing. Hank barked out a laugh. Lord Almighty. I shoved a billionaire into a tree. Annie's eyes widened fully now. You really own Whitmore Industries? Richard sighed softly. Apparently my disguise wasn't very good. Hank leaned against the counter, amused with himself. Well, ain't that something? Maple Ridge got itself a celebrity. Evelyn finally looked up directly at Hank. And yet you're still acting like a fool in front of him for free. That cut deeper than Richard's anger had. Hank straightened. You think money makes him better than me? No, Evelyn said calmly. Character does. The words landed hard. Annie pretended to organize thread spools while watching carefully. Richard stayed still near the chair, hands relaxed at his sides. Years earlier, he might have answered insult with fists. Years in business had taught him something different. Most loud men eventually defeated themselves if given enough room. Hank scoffed loudly. Easy for y'all to preach. Rich folks always get treated better. Richard answered before Evelyn could. Is that what happened this morning? Hank looked at him. Because from where I stood, Richard continued, I saw a drunk man shove somebody in public while half the street looked away. That ain't what happened. No? Richard stepped closer. Then tell me, what exactly happened? Hank's mouth opened, then closed again. The silence exposed him faster than an argument would have. Evelyn returned calmly to folding fabric. People who behave badly usually need noise around them. Quiet makes them nervous. Hank glared at her. You always got something to say. That's because I'm 82 and earned the right. Annie coughed suddenly into her hand, to hide another laugh. Hank pointed at her. You think this is funny? No, Annie replied honestly. Mostly tiring. Richard saw it then. Hank was not dangerous in the way wealthy men feared danger. He was dangerous in the exhausting way small-town bitterness often became after years of disappointment, drinking, and feeling left behind. Still, bitterness had teeth. Hank looked around the shop again. So what now? Rich man gonna save the neighborhood? Buy Miss Evelyn a shiny new sewing machine? Evelyn answered instantly. Don't start counting another man's money before you've counted your own blessings. That old machine probably belongs in a junkyard. Evelyn rested one hand on the Singer machine beside her. This machine fed 3 generations. Hank rolled his eyes. Yeah? Looks like it's getting tired. Richard noticed Annie stiffen beside the counter. That machine mattered to them. Hank noticed too. That was why he kept talking. You know what this town really needs? Hank said loudly. Not thread, jobs. But rich folks like him leave and never come back till they want to feel sentimental. The accusation lingered longer than Richard expected. Because part of it was true. Richard met Hank's eyes. You're angry at your life. I understand that. But don't confuse that with permission to mistreat people. Hank laughed bitterly. Easy speech from a billionaire. No, Richard replied. Easy speech from somebody who remembers being broke. Hank stared at him. Evelyn's sewing stopped again. Annie looked slowly toward Richard. Hank scoffed. You expect me to believe that? I slept behind Miller's gas station when I was 18, Richard said evenly. 3 nights straight. The room went quiet again. Even Hank seemed uncertain now. Richard continued calmly. Your problem is you think suffering gives you the right to spread it around. Hank's face reddened. You don't know a damn thing about me. No, Richard admitted, but I know exactly what bitterness looks like when a man decides it's easier than responsibility. For the first time since entering the shop, Hank lost his grin completely. Outside, a siren wailed faintly somewhere across town before fading again. Annie watched both men carefully, worried the tension might snap into something physical. Then Evelyn spoke without raising her voice. Hank. Something in her tone carried age, authority, and disappointment all at once. Hank looked toward her reluctantly. You knew your mama, Evelyn said. And she'd cry herself sick seeing what you became. The words hit him harder than anything else had. His jaw tightened. For a second, Richard thought the man might explode. Instead, Hank grabbed the front door handle roughly. Town's full of judgment, he muttered. No, Evelyn replied. Just mirrors. Hank shoved the door open hard enough to rattle the bell overhead and disappeared back onto Main Street. Silence filled the shop after he left. Annie let out a breath. Lord, Richard looked toward the door. Does he always do that? Mostly on days ending in Y, Annie answered. Evelyn resumed folding fabric. Hank Doyle's problem started years before whiskey. Booze just introduced the rest of us to it. Richard sat back down slowly. Annie looked at him differently now. Not because of the billionaire part. Because of the gas station. You really slept behind Miller's? Yes. With rats and all? Richard smiled faintly. One of them stole half my sandwich. That's rude. It felt personal at the time. Annie laughed quietly. Evelyn watched both of them over the rim of her glasses. Careful, Annie. Wealthy men become charming once they stop acting important. Richard shook his head. I'm getting attacked from every direction in this shop. That means we like you, Annie said. The words settled warmly before she seemed to realize she had said them aloud. Richard looked down at the repaired shoulder seam again. The stitches still held perfectly. Richard ran his thumb lightly over the repaired seam while Annie gathered loose thread clippings from the counter. Outside, afternoon sunlight stretched across Main Street, turning the dusty shop window gold around the edges. For a little while, nobody spoke. Then Evelyn looked at the clock above the doorway. Lord, she muttered, I forgot Clarence Pickett's church jacket. Annie glanced up. The gray one? The funeral's tomorrow morning, and I still need to shorten the sleeves. Evelyn pushed herself slowly upright from the chair, one hand pressing against her knee. If that man stands at another podium looking like he borrowed clothes from his taller brother, his wife's gonna blame me till Christmas. I'll do it, Annie offered. You've got steadier hands than me today? Depends how much you complain while watching. That means no. Richard watched the exchange with quiet amusement. The rhythm between them reminded him of music played so long nobody noticed the melody anymore. Evelyn carried the gray jacket toward the fitting mirror in the corner. Annie followed with pins between her lips. and a measuring tape hanging around her neck. Richard sat back, listening to the soft movement of fabric, scissors, and conversation. "Mr. Richard," Annie said around the pins. "You hungry?" He blinked. "What? You've been sitting here half the afternoon. Most grown men get mean when they haven't eaten." "He already got mean outside," Evelyn muttered. Richard smiled. "I'm fine." "That means yes," Annie said. She disappeared through a narrow doorway behind the counter leading into the small kitchen area. A few seconds later, cabinet doors opened and closed. Richard looked toward Evelyn. "She always decides things for people?" Since she was little, Evelyn adjusted the jacket sleeve against the mannequin. When Annie was 10, she told the pastor his sermon was too long right, in the middle of Sunday lunch. What happened? He shortened the next week's sermon. Richard laughed quietly. Evelyn glanced at him. "You needed that." "What?" That laugh. Richard leaned back in the chair. "Maybe. You carry too much in your shoulders. Comes with business." "No," Evelyn corrected gently. "Comes with life." The sewing machine hummed again. Richard watched her hands. They trembled more now than earlier, especially when lifting heavier fabric. The realization bothered him. "You should hire help," he said. "I did." Evelyn nodded toward the kitchen. "She refuses to leave." "That's different. It's family." "That's exactly why it's different." Evelyn looked up from the jacket slowly. "You got grandchildren?" "No." "Wish you did?" Richard thought about his son for a moment. About conversations reduced to quarterly reports and legal documents. About birthdays missed because meetings seemed urgent at the time. "Yes," he admitted quietly. Evelyn pinned the sleeve hem carefully. "Regret sneaks up on people after 50. Before that, folks call it ambition." Annie returned carrying 3 mismatched plates balanced against her arm. "I found leftover chicken and biscuits." Richard raised a brow. "You cooked?" She reheated. Evelyn said, "That still counts." Annie set the plates down on a small table near the sewing machine. "Grandma, sit before your knees, start another argument. I raised you too bossy. You raised me practical." Richard smiled into his tea glass. That phrase sounds familiar. They ate together in the small shop surrounded by hanging garments and spools of thread. The food was simple: fried chicken reheated in the oven, biscuits wrapped in a dish towel to keep warm, canned green beans seasoned with bacon grease. Richard realized halfway through the meal that he could not remember the last time he ate without checking his phone between bites. Annie noticed him looking around. "You keep staring at everything." "I'm remembering." "That good or bad?" "A little of both." Evelyn sipped sweet tea slowly. "Memory's honest once enough time passes. Problem is, people usually aren't ready for honesty by then." Richard looked toward the old Singer machine. "You still use the same one?" "Bought it secondhand in 1979. You could probably sell it for antique money now." Evelyn nearly looked offended. "Sell my machine?" "Child, I'd sooner sell a kidney." Annie laughed. "She means that, literally." Richard shook his head. "I knew a man in Boston once who paid $30,000 for a vintage sewing machine." Evelyn froze mid-bite. "30,000? Yes. For something meant to stitch pants?" "He collected antiques." Evelyn stared at her machine suspiciously now. That fool needed church. Annie burst into laughter so suddenly she had to set down her fork. Richard laughed with her this time, fully. The sound surprised him, not because he had forgotten how, because he had forgotten how natural it could feel. The bell above the door jingled again. A thin, older woman stepped carefully inside carrying a garment bag. "Oh," she said, stopping short when she saw Richard sitting there. "I didn't realize y'all had company." "Come on in, Miss Gloria," Annie said. The woman approached slowly, eyes narrowing toward Richard. "Hold on now. I know that face." Richard closed his eyes briefly. "Here we go." Miss Gloria pointed at him suddenly. "Television," Evelyn sighed. Apparently his disguise only works on teenagers. Miss Gloria looked horrified. "You're that billionaire man." "That depends who's asking." "The hospital donor fellow." She clutched the garment bag tighter. "Lord Evelyn, why didn't you tell me?" "Because he walked in wearing a torn shirt, not a crown." Miss Gloria stared at Richard another moment before her expression shifted into something softer. "Well, I'll be." Richard stood politely. "Nice to meet you." She shook his hand carefully like she expected expensive people to break easier. Then her eyes dropped to the repaired shoulder seam. You sewed his shirt? She asked Annie. She did the first repair, Evelyn answered. I corrected her mistakes. I heard that. Miss Gloria looked between all three of them. This town's gonna lose its mind once people hear about this. Richard's smile faded slightly. I'd rather they didn't. Miss Gloria tilted her head. Too late for that, probably. Maple Ridge survives on gossip and casseroles. Annie nodded. Mostly gossip. Miss Gloria lowered her voice. Folks already talking about what happened outside Riley's. Richard's expression hardened. She noticed immediately. Honey, don't let that bother you. People in this town been excusing drunk men for generations. Doesn't make it right. Evelyn folded her napkin carefully. That's because too many people mistake loudness for authority. Miss Gloria looked at Richard again. You pressing charges? No. Why not? Richard glanced toward the window. I didn't come back here looking for a fight. Evelyn studied him quietly after that. Miss Gloria handed over the garment bag. Well, whether you like it or not, folks are gonna talk. Especially once they realize you came back to visit Evelyn Carter. Why especially that? The older woman smiled gently. Because everybody in this town knows Miss Evelyn spent half her life helping people nobody else bothered noticing. The room quieted again. Miss Gloria patted Evelyn's shoulder before leaving. Try not to work too late. No promises. After the bell above the door settled, Annie looked toward Richard. She's right, you know. About what? People around here remember who helped them. Richard glanced at Evelyn. She helped a lot of people, he said quietly. Evelyn adjusted her glasses. And most of them forgot by Tuesday. Richard shook his head slowly. Not all of them. Not all of them. Evelyn looked at Richard for a long moment after he said it. Something softened in her face, then disappeared again beneath habit and caution. Well, she said quietly. Memory's kinder than most people. Annie gathered the empty plates and carried them toward the sink in the back room. Richard stood to help automatically, reaching for one of the glasses. Evelyn noticed immediately. Careful. Wealthy men touching dishes usually means they're apologizing for something. Richard carried the plate anyway. Maybe I am. For what? For disappearing. Evelyn waved him toward the sink. Dry the glasses if you're gonna stand there feeling guilty. Annie smirked while handing him a dish towel. Congratulations. You've been promoted to kitchen duty. I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts. And now you're drying tea glasses. Life moves fast. Richard shook his head, smiling faintly as he dried the chipped glass from earlier. The kitchen area behind the shop was barely larger than a pantry. A small table sat beneath a window with faded curtains patterned in strawberries. Old magnets crowded the refrigerator door, church announcements, grocery lists, a photograph of Annie at what looked like a middle school graduation. He noticed another photo beside it, a younger Annie standing next to Evelyn outside the shop. The sign above them looked brighter then. Annie's smile wider too. Richard pointed at it. How old were you there? 12, Annie answered while rinsing plates. That was before the roof started leaking every spring. Richard glanced upward instinctively. Don't look too hard, Annie warned. You might see daylight. Evelyn called from the front room. The roof's holding. The bucket in the hallway says otherwise. That bucket exaggerates. Richard dried another plate slowly. You really stayed here all these years? Evelyn's voice drifted back through the doorway. Somebody had to. Annie lowered her voice. Developers tried buying the building twice. Richard looked over. What happened? Grandma ran them out. I politely declined. You threatened one guy with your cane. He deserved emphasis. Richard laughed quietly again. Annie leaned against the counter while drying silverware. Most people leave Maple Ridge if they can. But not you? My grandma's here. The answer came quickly, naturally. Richard studied her for a second. That enough? For now. There was something unfinished in the way she said it. Before Richard could ask more, the bell above the front door jingled again. A teenage boy stepped inside carrying a grocery sack. Miss Evelyn? In here. The boy rounded the doorway and stopped cold when he saw Richard. Whoa. Annie sighed immediately. Don't start. That's him, right? The boy whispered loudly. The billionaire guy? Richard lifted a hand. Unfortunately, the boy stared openly. My uncle works at one of your warehouses in Atlanta. Hopefully he says nice things. He says the coffee sucks. Richard nodded seriously. That sounds accurate. The boy burst out laughing. Evelyn entered from the front room carrying a measuring tape around her neck. Marcus, unless that sack contains my thread order, stop gawking and hand it over. Marcus quickly passed her the bag but kept glancing toward Richard. Whole town's talking already. Richard sighed under his breath. Marcus noticed the repaired shoulder seam. Hold up. Annie fixed your shirt? She assaulted me with kindness, Richard said. That sounds like Annie. Annie rolled her eyes. Why are you here besides gossip? Grandma sent peach cobbler. Marcus pointed toward Evelyn. Said you forgot church choir practice yesterday because you were working again. Evelyn muttered something under her breath. Marcus looked back at Richard carefully. You really grew up here? Yes. Then why'd you leave? The question was innocent. That made it harder. Richard folded the dish towel slowly before answering, because staying felt smaller than surviving back then. Marcus nodded as if trying to understand adult decisions before adulthood arrived. My mom says rich people forget where they come from. Richard glanced toward the front window. Some do. And you? Before Richard answered, Evelyn spoke quietly from beside the sewing table. He came back. The room fell silent for a moment after that. Marcus eventually shifted awkwardly. Well, that's true. Annie hid a small smile while drying the last fork. Marcus headed toward the front door, then stopped halfway. Oh, and Mr. Doyle's over at Riley's telling everybody he almost beat up a billionaire. Richard rubbed his forehead. Annie laughed outright. Almost? Marcus shrugged. That's how drunk stories work. Evelyn sat back down at the sewing machine. Hank Doyle once lost a fistfight to a folding chair. Let him enjoy his imagination. Marcus grinned and finally left. The shop quieted again except for the hum of the sewing machine. Richard wandered slowly toward the front display window. Across the street, late afternoon sunlight stretched long across the sidewalks. Maple Ridge looked tired but familiar in a way cities never could. You know what's strange, he said. Evelyn adjusted fabric beneath the needle. Probably. I spent years trying not to think about this town. Then I spent years wanting to come back. He paused. Neither one worked. That's because home doesn't stop existing just because you leave it. Richard looked toward her. Did you ever want to leave? Evelyn considered that honestly. Once. Annie glanced up, surprised. Really? Back in '86. Your granddaddy had just died. Bills stacked high enough to use as furniture. She smiled faintly at the memory. Thought about moving to Savannah to live near my sister. What stopped you? Richard asked. Evelyn threaded another needle carefully. This shop. Annie shook her head affectionately. Only you would stay in a struggling town over a sewing machine. No, Evelyn corrected gently. Over people. Richard understood immediately. The shop was not fabric and thread to her. It was weddings altered at the last minute, funeral suits repaired overnight, choir robes hemmed before Sunday service. Quiet dignity, stitched together one small emergency at a time. You gave people pride back, Richard said quietly. Evelyn shrugged. I gave them hems that fit. That's not the same thing? She looked at him over her glasses. You tell me. Richard fell silent, because suddenly he remembered how that old repaired shirt had felt before his first interview all those years ago. Clean. Whole. Like maybe the world had not decided everything about him yet. The bell above the door jingled softly once more. This time 2 older black women entered carrying church hats and garment bags. They stopped immediately when they saw Richard near the window. One whispered loudly, Lord have mercy. Evelyn got billionaires waiting in line now. The other squinted at Richard. Still looks tired though. Annie nearly doubled over trying not to laugh. Richard smiled helplessly while Evelyn calmly adjusted her glasses and said, Money helps many things. Apparently rest isn't one of them. Richard smiled helplessly while Evelyn calmly adjusted her glasses and said, Money helps many things. Apparently rest isn't one of them. The 2 women laughed as they crossed the shop carrying garment bags and oversized church hats trimmed with silk flowers. Afternoon, Miss Evelyn, the taller woman said. We brought the choir robes. You brought them late, Evelyn replied. We brought pie too. Well then, your sins are reduced. Annie took the garment bags while the shorter woman kept staring at Richard openly. That really him? Yes, Annie said. And if you keep staring, he might charge admission. The woman ignored her and looked at Richard instead. Honey, you got one of those faces television makes too shiny. Richard laughed under his breath. I'll mention that to the network. You from around here? She asked. He grew up here. Annie answered before Richard could. The woman blinked twice. Then Lord, Maple Ridge really did let somebody escape. Evelyn pointed a measuring tape at her. Bernice Hill, you stop talking about this town like it's a prison. Bernice shrugged. Depends what side of the tracks you were born on. The room quieted slightly after that. Richard noticed Annie lower her eyes for just a moment before returning to the garment bags. It was quick, but he caught it. Evelyn caught it too. Bernice seemed to realize her words had landed heavier than intended. I just mean opportunities, Miss Evelyn. I know what you meant, Evelyn said calmly. Still doesn't make it lighter. Richard looked around the shop again. The fading paint, the patched curtains, the old sewing machine that probably deserved retirement years ago but kept working anyway because nobody here had the luxury of replacing useful things before absolutely necessary. He thought about the neighborhoods 10 miles outside Atlanta where Whitmore Industries had built distribution centers. Clean sidewalks. Renovated storefronts. Fresh asphalt. Investment followed money the way rivers followed gravity. Places like Maple Ridge got leftovers. Annie hung the choir robes carefully near the back wall. Grandma fixed all these last year for free. Bernice sighed dramatically. That's because church folk somehow lose buttons faster than sinners. That's because church folk wear uncomfortable clothes longer, Evelyn replied. The women laughed again. Richard found himself watching Annie more than the conversation. She moved through the shop with practiced familiarity, knowing exactly where every spool, pin cushion, and measuring tape belonged. She could probably find thread in the dark. You teach her everything? He asked Evelyn quietly. Itre. Annie glanced over. Except taxes. She hides whenever bills come out. Because numbers ruin good afternoons. Richard smiled faintly. I know people who'd argue the opposite. That's because rich people think spreadsheets are personalities. Annie coughed suddenly into her sleeve to hide another laugh. Bernice looked between them. Well now, Annie teasing billionaires like regular folks. That's new. He's sitting in Grandma's chair drinking sweet tea, Annie replied. Hard to act intimidated. Richard nodded toward the sewing machine. I think your grandmother intimidates enough people for this entire block. True, Annie admitted. The shorter woman, Loretta, stepped closer to Richard. Can I ask you something honest? Depends how dangerous it is. Why come back now? The room slowed again. Richard looked toward the front window before answering. Because eventually success gets quiet enough for old memories to get loud. Loretta nodded slowly like she understood exactly. Bernice crossed her arms. And what happens after you remember? Richard thought about it. I'm figuring that out. Evelyn spoke without looking up from the robe she was pinning. That's old people talk right there. What? Trying to repair things before time decides for you. The words settled deep. Richard rubbed his thumb against the repaired shoulder seam again. He had done that all afternoon without noticing. The stitches had become a reminder every time his hand drifted there. Annie noticed too. You keep touching that shirt like it's fragile. It mattered once. And now? Richard looked at her honestly. Now I think I forgot how much small things matter. Nobody answered immediately. Outside, a freight train horn sounded somewhere far beyond town. The low, mournful sound rolled through Maple Ridge before fading into the warm evening air. Bernice sighed softly. Used to hear those every night growing up. Back when trains actually stopped here, Evelyn said. Back when downtown stayed busy after 6. Richard glanced out the window again. What happened? All the usual things, Loretta answered. Factories closed. Young folks left. Stores dried up. People stopped believing Main Street belonged to them, Annie added quietly. And when people stop believing a place matters, it starts looking like it. Richard absorbed that. He had spent years in meetings discussing economic shifts and regional decline while looking at graphs projected onto screens. Sitting here now, hearing ordinary people describe it without polished language, the damage felt more human. Evelyn finished pinning a choir robe sleeve. Maple Ridge didn't die. It just got tired. Bernice nodded. Difference is nobody sends tired towns flowers. Richard looked slowly around the room again. The loose ceiling paint, the aging wiring near the back wall, the old machine humming harder than it should. The bucket Annie joked about catching rainwater. A thought formed in his mind before he could stop it. How much would it cost? He asked suddenly. Everyone looked at him. To fix what? Annie asked carefully. This place. Evelyn's expression changed immediately. Richard, I'm asking. You're thinking too fast. No, he said quietly. I'm thinking 32 years too late. Annie shifted uneasily. Mr. Richard, he looked at the faded walls again. The roof, wiring, paint, equipment, whatever needs doing. Evelyn set the choir robe down carefully. No, Richard turned toward her. You don't even know what I'm offering. Yes, I do. Her voice stayed calm but firm. Charity. It's not charity. What else would you call it? A thank you. Evelyn shook her head slowly. One meal and one repaired shirt don't buy ownership of people. That's not what I want. Good, because you won't get it. The room fell still. Annie looked between them anxiously. Bernice and Loretta suddenly became very interested in the choir robes. Richard lowered his voice. Evelyn, this shop helped build my life whether you realize it or not, and I'm grateful you remember. She met his eyes steadily. But don't confuse gratitude with rescuing. I'm not trying to rescue anybody. Then stop looking around this room like broken things offend you. That one struck hard because it was partly true. Richard exhaled slowly. I just hate seeing you struggle. Evelyn's face softened slightly, then hardened again. Struggle isn't shameful, Richard. People forgetting each other is. Silence filled the shop. Then Annie spoke carefully into it. Maybe, she said quietly, there's a difference between pity and somebody simply wanting to help. Maybe, Annie said quietly, there's a difference between pity and somebody simply wanting to help. The room stayed silent after that. Evelyn looked at her granddaughter for several seconds before speaking. And maybe there's a difference between help and feeling responsible for everybody who once showed you kindness. Richard leaned back slowly in the chair near the window. You think this is guilt? I think guilt and gratitude wear similar coats. Bernice muttered under her breath. That's a line right there. Loretta nodded quietly beside her. Richard looked toward Evelyn again. You fed me when nobody else would, and I'd do it again. You changed my life. Evelyn adjusted the fabric in her lap. No, you changed your life. I just gave you dry clothes and soup. That's not a small thing to someone with nowhere to go. Evelyn's expression softened for the first time in several minutes. I know. Annie watched both of them carefully. She could feel the argument wasn't really about money anymore. It was about dignity, debt, and the uncomfortable weight kindness left behind when somebody carried it too long. Bernice broke the tension first. Well, I personally think if a billionaire offers to fix the roof, you at least let him look at the bucket. That earned a laugh from Annie. Even Evelyn smiled faintly. You just want to stop hearing me complain about rainwater. I absolutely do. Richard rubbed his hands together slowly. I'm not asking to buy the shop. Good. I'm asking whether there's a way to help without insulting you. Evelyn studied him over her glasses. That depends. Can wealthy people help quietly? Or do they break out in hives without putting their names on buildings? Richard smiled despite himself. Some can. Which kind are you? The question lingered. Outside, evening shadows stretched longer across Main Street. The diner sign flickered again in the growing dusk. Somewhere farther down the block, somebody rolled metal shutters over a storefront window for the night. Richard answered honestly, I don't know anymore. That answer seemed to matter more to Evelyn than any polished speech could have. Annie leaned against the counter. Grandma, what? You let people help church members all the time. That's different. Why? Because church ladies travel in casseroles and gossip. Rich men arrive with paperwork. Bernice laughed loudly enough to shake the garment bags. Richard nodded slowly. Fair criticism. Annie crossed her arms. Still doesn't mean every offer's an insult. Evelyn sighed softly through her nose. Child, you're young enough to still believe help comes without strings. Richard looked toward Annie. And you? She shrugged. I think sometimes people need help. That's all. The simplicity of it struck him harder than another speech would have. Loretta adjusted her church hat. World got people so suspicious nowadays. Nobody knows how to receive kindness anymore. Because too many folks weaponize it later, Evelyn answered. Nobody argued with that. Richard looked around the shop once more. The old Singer machine hummed softly beside Evelyn's chair. Faded photographs covered the walls like stitched pieces of memory. This place had survived decades, not because it was profitable, but because Evelyn Carter refused to abandon people who still needed things repaired. That kind of loyalty was rare enough to hurt. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out a business card. Annie's eyes narrowed immediately. Here come the rich people tools. Richard ignored the comment and placed the card gently on the table beside Evelyn's tea glass. No contracts, he said. No publicity, no reporters. No building with my name on it. Evelyn glanced at the card but didn't touch it. If the roof gets worse, Richard continued quietly, or the wiring fails, or the machine finally gives up after 40 years, call me. Evelyn remained still. Richard slid the card a little closer. Not because I pity you, because somebody once helped me survive, and I'd like the chance to return some of that to the place it came from. The room stayed quiet. Bernice suddenly found the choir robe extremely interesting again. Loretta examined her fingernails. Annie looked at Evelyn carefully. Finally, Evelyn reached over, turned the card upside down without reading it, and said, I'll think about it. Richard smiled faintly. That's more than I expected. Don't get emotional. I haven't agreed to anything. Noted. Annie looked relieved anyway. The bell above the door jingled faintly as a breeze pushed against it from outside. Evening had settled fully over Maple Ridge now. Streetlights buzzed awake one by one beyond the shop window. Bernice gathered her purse. Well, if we stay longer, Evelyn's gonna start charging rent. She already charges emotionally. Loretta muttered. The women said their goodbyes and headed toward the door. Before leaving, Bernice stopped beside Richard. You know, she said quietly, most folks who make it out don't come back unless there's a funeral. Richard glanced toward Evelyn. Maybe I got tired of burying things. Bernice nodded slowly, like she understood exactly what he meant. After they left, the shop became quieter than before. Annie carried empty tea glasses toward the sink while Evelyn folded finished choir robes with careful hands. Richard checked the time on his watch and frowned. You expecting somebody? Annie asked. My assistant probably thinks I've been kidnapped. That'd improve her afternoon? Him? And no, it would ruin it. Annie smiled slightly. You got people worried about you. Mostly people paid to worry. That still counts a little. Richard looked toward the darkening street outside. I should probably head back to the hotel soon. Evelyn nodded without looking up. Town gets noisy after dark on payday weekends. That sounds like experience talking. That sounds like living here 82 years. Annie dried her hands on a towel. You staying long? A few days. Just a visit? Richard hesitated. The truth surprised even him. I'm not sure anymore. Evelyn looked up at that. For the first time since he walked into the shop, she saw something beneath the expensive watch, the polished manners, and the careful control wealthy men learned to wear. Loneliness. Not dramatic loneliness, not self-pity, just the quiet kind that settled into people who spent too many years building things instead of belonging somewhere. Evelyn recognized it instantly because she had seen it in tired customers for decades. You got somewhere to eat tonight? She asked. Richard blinked. I assumed the hotel restaurant. Evelyn made a face. Hotel food tastes like meetings. That bad? Worse. Annie hid a grin. Evelyn folded the final robe and set it aside. Come by the house tomorrow evening. Richard looked surprised. For what? Supper, Evelyn said plainly. You still owe me for disappearing 32 years. Supper, Evelyn said plainly. You still owe me for disappearing 32 years. Richard stared at her for a moment, genuinely caught off guard. Annie leaned against the counter with a small grin. Careful. That's basically a formal invitation around here. I gathered that. Evelyn pointed a finger at him. 6 o'clock. Don't arrive with fancy desserts nobody asked for. Richard lifted both hands. Understood. And no business talk at my dinner table. That one may be harder. Then practice. Annie laughed quietly while gathering folded choir robes into garment bags. Richard looked around the shop one more time, committing details to memory without meaning to. The fading wallpaper. The old machine. The worn floorboards smoothed by decades of footsteps. Places carried pieces of the people who stayed inside them long enough. You always work this late? he asked Evelyn. Used to work later. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Annie shook her head. She'll stay here till midnight if somebody calls about funeral clothes. Dead folks still deserve proper hems, Evelyn muttered. Richard smiled. You really believe that? I believe dignity matters most when life gets hard. That line stayed with him. Outside, Main Street had quieted into evening. Neon signs glowed weakly through the dark. Somewhere down the block, laughter spilled from Riley's bar before fading again. Richard reached for his jacket near the chair. You parked far? Annie asked. At the hotel lot. That's 6 blocks. I can manage 6 blocks. At night? Richard raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? Annie exchanged a quick look with Evelyn. Normally? Annie said. No. Tonight? Hank Doyle's probably drunk enough to start arguing with traffic signs. Richard almost smiled. I think I can survive Hank Doyle. That's what traffic signs probably thought too. Evelyn stood slowly from the sewing machine. Annie. Walk him halfway. Grandma. Umor me. Richard shook his head immediately. That's not necessary. Evelyn gave him the same look she probably used on stubborn customers for 40 years. Neither was arguing with strangers under an oak tree this morning, but here we are. Annie grabbed her cardigan from the wall hook. Come on, Mr. Richard. Before she starts assigning us a curfew, I heard that. You were supposed to. Richard thanked Evelyn quietly before stepping outside with Annie. The bell above the shop door jingled behind them as warm night air settled around Main Street. The town looked different after dark. Storefront windows reflected yellow streetlights across cracked sidewalks. A few cars rolled slowly through downtown with music drifting from open windows. Somewhere nearby, crickets had started up beneath the sound of distant laughter and clinking bottles from Riley's bar. Annie walked with her hands tucked into her cardigan pockets. You don't have to babysit me, Richard said after a moment. I know. Then why are you? She shrugged lightly. Grandma worries. That's her hobby. And yours? Mine's fixing things, apparently. Richard glanced sideways at her. You planning to stay in Maple Ridge forever? Annie kicked lightly at a crack in the sidewalk before answering. I don't know. You ever want more? That depends what more means. Different city. Better opportunities. Bigger life. Annie looked ahead toward the dim streetlights. People always talk like, leaving automatically makes life bigger. Sometimes it does. And sometimes folks just end up lonely in expensive apartments. Richard laughed softly under his breath. You really don't miss much. Nope. They passed the old movie theater with its broken marquee letters. Annie slowed near the entrance. My granddad used to bring Grandma here every Friday before he died, she said. She still won't walk this side of the street too fast. Richard looked toward the dark ticket booth. You were close to him? Mostly through stories. He passed when I was little. She paused. Grandma says he could repair anything, except his own health. That sounds like something she'd say. She loved him a lot. Richard nodded quietly. The closer they got to Riley's bar, the louder the music became. A few men stood outside smoking beneath the flickering beer sign. Annie's shoulders tightened slightly. Richard noticed. You okay? Just keep walking. One of the men glanced over. Evening, Annie. Evening. Another man noticed Richard beside her. Well, look at that. Maple Ridge got itself rich company tonight. The tone carried amusement more than hostility, but Annie still kept moving. Then the bar door burst open. Hank Doyle stumbled out laughing at something behind him before spotting Richard under the streetlight. Well, hell, Hank slurred loudly. There's my favorite millionaire. Annie muttered under her breath. Of course. Richard stopped walking. Hank swaggered toward them, whiskey heavy in every step. You following me now? I'm walking to my hotel. That fancy place by the highway? Yes. Hank grinned crookedly. Bet the pillows cost more than my truck. Probably not a healthy comparison. One of the men outside the bar snorted, trying not to laugh. Hank pointed at Richard's repaired shoulder. Aw, look. Shirt still hanging in there. Annie folded her arms. Because unlike you, some people know how to repair damage. Girl, you always got something sharp to say. Only when necessary. Hank stared at Richard for a long moment, then unexpectedly asked, You really grow up here? Yes. And now you rich enough to buy the whole town? Richard answered calmly. That's not why I came back. Then why? The question sounded less mocking than before. Tired, maybe. Richard glanced toward Annie before answering. I came back because somebody here once helped me when nobody else did. Hank scoffed softly, but there was less bite in it now. Town didn't help me much. No, Richard said honestly. Maybe it didn't. That seemed to catch Hank off guard. One of the men near the bar muttered, Damn. Hank looked away briefly, embarrassed by the sudden seriousness. Doesn't matter anyway. It matters, Annie said quietly. Hank rubbed a hand over his face. Under the streetlight, he suddenly looked older than before. Not dangerous. Just worn down by too many years making the same mistakes. My daddy worked that lumber yard till it closed, he muttered. After that, everything around here started shrinking. Nobody interrupted him. Hank laughed bitterly. Guess whiskey was cheaper than hope. Richard understood that sentence more than he wanted to. The street stayed quiet except for music leaking from the bar doorway. Finally, Hank pointed vaguely toward Richard. Still think I was an ass this morning. You were. Hank nodded once. Fair. Annie blinked in surprise. So what now? Hank asked. You gonna save Maple Ridge? Richard looked around the dim street. The empty storefronts. The tired buildings. The people standing outside bars because there was nowhere else to go. No, he said quietly. I think Maple Ridge probably needs people to stop giving up on it first. Hank stared at him for a second, then barked out one rough laugh. Good luck with that. He turned and wandered back toward Riley's bar without another word. Annie watched him disappear inside. That might be the first honest conversation Hank Doyle's had in 10 years. Richard slipped his hands into his pockets. People usually get honest when life runs out of places to hide them. They continued walking in silence for another block. Then Annie glanced sideways at him. You meant what you said back there? About what? People giving up on places. Richard looked ahead toward the glowing hotel sign in the distance. Yes, he said quietly. I did. Yes, he said quietly. I did. Annie looked at him a moment longer before nodding toward the glowing hotel sign ahead. Well, there's your palace. Richard laughed softly. Trust me, it's mostly overpriced carpet and people apologizing for things that aren't broken. That sounds exhausting. It is. They stopped near the entrance drive where expensive black SUVs sat lined beneath hanging lights. A valet in a red jacket noticed Richard immediately and hurried forward with visible relief. Mr. Whitmore, the young man said, almost breathless. Sir, your assistant's been trying to reach you for hours. Richard pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen full of missed calls and messages. Right, he muttered. The valet glanced uncertainly toward Annie standing beside him in her worn cardigan and old sneakers. The difference between them looked sharp under hotel lights. Annie noticed it too. So did Richard. The valet recovered quickly. Would you like me to call Mr. Bennett down, sir? No. Tell him I'm alive and nobody kidnapped me. Yes, sir. The valet hurried inside. Annie folded her arms lightly against the evening breeze. Well, guess this is where regular people disappear from the story. Richard looked at her. You think that's what this is? She shrugged. Big hotels usually mean the ending's near. Something about the way she said it bothered him. He glanced toward the bright lobby windows where men in suits moved behind polished glass carrying briefcases and phones. For years that world had felt normal to him. Necessary even. Now it suddenly looked loud. You know, he said slowly, I've sat in meetings worth more money than this entire town. Annie raised a brow. That's supposed to impress me? No. Richard looked back toward Main Street behind them. Honestly, I think it's starting to embarrass me. Annie studied him carefully under the hotel lights. That happens when people remember they're human. Before Richard could answer, the hotel doors burst open, and a thin man in a navy suit hurried outside holding 2 phones. Sir, he called. Good Lord. Richard winced slightly. That would be Daniel. Daniel Bennett stopped short when he saw Annie standing there. Then his eyes moved immediately to Richard's repaired shoulder seam. What happened to your shirt? It met Maple Ridge. Daniel stared another second. Your son's called 6 times. I figured. He thought something happened. Something did. Daniel blinked. Should I be concerned by that answer? Richard smiled faintly. Not tonight. Daniel lowered his voice. Sir, tomorrow's Atlanta meeting. Cancelled. Daniel looked genuinely shaken. Cancelled? Yes. You flew down here specifically to prepare for it. I changed my mind. Daniel glanced between Richard and Annie as if trying to solve an equation with missing numbers. Annie took a small step backward. I should head home. Richard looked toward her immediately. You walking alone? I've lived here my whole life, Mr. Richard. That wasn't my question. A tiny smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I'll be fine. Daniel looked confused by the entire exchange. Richard ignored him and reached into his pocket again, pulling out a folded $100 bill. Annie's face changed instantly. Don't. It's not charity. That's exactly what people say before charity. It's for helping me today. You already thanked me. Richard held the bill out anyway. Annie. She shook her head firmly. No. Daniel looked stunned that anyone in front of a luxury hotel was refusing money from Richard Whitmore. Annie noticed his expression immediately. That look right there, she said quietly to Richard, is why Grandma gets stubborn. Richard slowly lowered the bill. Daniel finally found his voice. Sir, if this young lady assisted you today, surely compensation. She's not staff, Richard said sharply. Daniel stopped talking. The difference in Richard's tone surprised all three of them. Annie looked down briefly, then back up at him. Thank you. For what? For noticing. The valet returned awkwardly holding Richard's room key. Somewhere behind the lobby doors, a pianist played soft jazz nobody inside was actually listening to. Richard suddenly felt tired in a way sleep would not fix. You'll come tomorrow? Annie asked. To dinner? To Maple Ridge. Dinner's just where Grandma traps people. Richard smiled. Yes, I'll come. And don't wear another shirt Hank Doyle can ruin. I'll do my best. Annie started stepping backward toward Main Street. Good night, Mr. Richard. Good night, Annie. She turned and began walking beneath the dim streetlights toward the older part of town. Richard watched until she disappeared past the theater marquee. Daniel adjusted his tie carefully beside him. Sir, what exactly happened today? Richard looked down at the repaired shoulder seam again. A ripped shirt. A bench beneath an oak tree. A girl carrying thread and groceries. An old woman who remembered feeding hungry strangers before asking their names. He thought about the boardrooms waiting for him in Atlanta, the endless meetings, the polished people discussing profit margins while towns like Maple Ridge slowly forgot how to hope. Then he thought about Evelyn Carter saying struggle wasn't shameful. Forgetting each other was. A long overdue conversation, Richard said quietly. Daniel frowned slightly. With respect, sir, I don't understand. Richard looked toward Main Street again. That's because I'm only starting to. They headed inside the hotel together. The lobby smelled expensive and empty at the same time. Marble floors reflected golden chandelier light. A woman behind the front desk greeted Richard by name with practiced warmth. He barely noticed. In the elevator, Daniel carefully tried again. Your son expects you in Atlanta by noon tomorrow. Richard loosened his tie slightly. Then he'll be disappointed. Sir, I spent 30 years thinking success meant never slowing down. Richard glanced at his reflection in the elevator doors. Turns out sometimes it just means you get enough distance to see what you abandoned on the way there. Daniel fell silent. When the elevator doors opened onto the top floor, Richard walked toward his suite but stopped halfway down the hallway. What's the matter, sir? Daniel asked. Richard touched the repaired seam once more. It's strange, he admitted quietly. I own buildings bigger than that shop. Yes. But today was the first time in years something broken actually felt repaired. Daniel had no answer for that. Neither did Richard. But for the first time in a very long while, he thought maybe the answer was not waiting inside another meeting room. Maybe it was waiting at a dinner table in Maple Ridge, Georgia, beside an old sewing machine that refused to quit. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change the direction of someone's entire life. The story reminds us that dignity matters, whether a person is rich or poor, and that true character is revealed not by money or status, but by how we treat people when they are struggling. It also teaches that helping others should never be forgotten, because one moment of compassion can stay in a person's heart for decades and inspire them to give kindness back to the world. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,